Good morning, everyone. Very pleased to have everyone with us today. Thank you for joining us for this wonderful morning session, which is part of the Indigenous Education Week schedule. So take a look on Twitter and on Facebook and in your email, and there's a full schedule of great speakers that are sharing all kinds of knowledge from land to medicine to sovereignty. So lots of great things happening this week. This morning we have Dr. Jessie Popp, which will talk about bridging knowledge systems and prioritizing ecological research within and among Anishinabek Nation communities. So excellent conversation that we'll have this morning. I'd like to begin by recognizing and honoring the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. We would also like to recognize the traditional territory of Atikamek Anishinabek, on which Laurentian University is situated. We'd like to recognize the traditional territory of Wanabete First Nation, on which the city of Greater Sudbury is situated, and all and any other treaty territories on which our viewers reside today. Now more than ever, it is important to privilege these treaty territories and honor our relationships to one another and to the land. So I think our speaker today will definitely help us in understanding some of this. Dr. Jessie Popp is an alumni of Laurentian University, so we're really pleased to have you back with us virtually to hear what you're up to. She's the chair of Indigenous Environmental Science at the University of Guelph. She has published 21 peer-reviewed papers, chapters, and reports, and has taught courses on topics such as climate change, Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous medicine, foods, agricultural practices, and seminars in environmental issues, Indigenous perspectives. Her inclusive interdisciplinary research with holistic perspectives has become more important than ever. The number of species at risk across the globe are increasing, jeopardizing ecological integrity and traditional ways of life. Popp will continue to develop her nationally recognized multidisciplinary and collaborative research program, which is focused on terrestrial ecology in contexts relevant to Indigenous communities. She works collaboratively with researchers on campus, nationally and internationally, and with Indigenous peoples and communities. Ultimately, her research contributes to conservation, sustainability, and the progression of the natural sciences in the spirit of reconciliation. So we're really pleased to have you with us today. I'm very excited to hear what you have to share. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I'm really happy to be here today, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I just want to start by saying Ani, Jessie Indigenous Cause with Kwimkong Donjaba, Makwa Dodum, Anishinabek Ndao, Miigwech. Hi everyone. My name's Jessie, and I'm a member of Wikwemikong Unceded Territory. And I was invited here today to talk to you about some of the current research that's going on in my lab. So I'm going to talk to you today about bridging knowledge systems and prioritizing ecological research direction within and among Anishinabek Nation communities. So I think some of you are familiar with me a little bit and some probably not. So I want to chat a little bit more about myself. I did see a few biology people enter the room, so it's great to connect with you all. And yeah, so I'm a member of Wikwemikong Unceded Territory. Although I didn't grow up in the community, I grew up in Northern Ontario, in around the Sudbury area. And as Emily said, I was a student at Laurentian University for all my degrees, actually, for my bachelor, master, and PhD in biology and boreal ecology. So for the most part, a lot of the work I do is wildlife ecology. And I work a lot with large mammals, so species like caribou, which you can see in this image here. I've worked with elk, moose, wolves, bear, but more and more my work is branching out to taking more of an ecosystem or holistic approach in the environment. As we know, all things are interconnected. But that's sort of where I come from with my education, which has mainly been in Western scientific training through Laurentian University. So most of my work today takes a two-eyed seeing approach, or brings together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing to help us better understand ecological research questions. So this term two-eyed seeing, this is a term that was coined by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall from Unama'ki, or Cape Breton, which is in Nova Scotia. And Elder Albert Marshall says that you can better understand the world, or in my case, ecology, the environment, through seeing through two eyes or two lenses. So through one eye or lens, through Indigenous ways of knowing and seeing the world, Indigenous knowledge systems, and through another lens, through Western knowledge systems and ways of seeing the world. So and the idea is that each of these ways of seeing the world, knowledge systems, are complementary to one another. And so we can see a bigger picture, better understanding of the world or the environment or ecological research, for example. Now, on that note, so Raymond Periotti says that an individual's worldview, or the way that individual sees the world, has a major impact on the way that he or she interprets it. So the way you see the world, your worldview definitely has a huge impact on the way that you interpret the world, the way you see the world. So again, coming into, different worldviews can be very complementary to one another and see different things. But on that note, I want to say that there could be different worldviews among cultures, among nations, among communities, among family members and individuals. So individuals have different worldviews, right? But Leroy Littlebear, who's the founding director of Harvard University's Native American program, said that given Canada's cultural and linguistic diversity, it's foolish to suggest that a single Native perspective exists. Yet, there are unique ways of understanding events that have demonstrated to me and others there are culturally specific ways of appreciating what we may have previously considered to be universally accepted ideas. So yes, individuals have their own unique worldviews, but there are these similarities among cultures and thinking in terms of Indigenous cultures and Western culture, for example. So seeing through Indigenous and Western worldviews or ways of knowing, very complementary. And there's a lot of research existing today with researchers specifically pertaining to ecology, as that's sort of my expertise, who have been doing research that takes a two-eyed seeing approach, or just an approach that brings together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing and knowledge systems in ecological work. There's a lot of really great examples, and I encourage you to look for them. But I will today, for the sake of time, just share some of the work that I'm doing that's taking a two-eyed seeing approach. And one example stems back to my PhD. So my PhD was more of a Western scientific sort of PhD, but this is kind of where it all stems from, for me personally. So my PhD at Laurentian University with Dr. Frank Mallory was on elk reintroduction success. This gorgeous bull here is actually, a friend of mine took this photo of an elk just south of Sudbury. So this is from an elk, from a population just south of Sudbury, about 30 kilometers in the Burwash area. But elk weren't always there. So this is a map showing the historical and current distribution of elk on Turtle Island, or North America. So this light gray color you see is actually the historical distribution of elk, and this darker color of gray is the current distribution. So as you can see, elk used to range across most of North America, Turtle Island. But when Europeans arrived to Turtle Island, quickly following arrival, overharvest started happening for elk, like many species, and elk started disappearing. So they were extirpated or completely wiped out from the east. And as you can see, that these sort of this band of elk in the west, elk distribution in the west, that's because that's where there was mountains and sort of inhospitable areas for elk to for hunters to hunt elk. So sort of a safe hold for elk. So now you can see over in the east, you have these smaller pockets of dark gray, so current elk populations. These weren't here 100 years ago, but we've been slowly reintroducing elk, so taking elk from the west and bringing them to the east into these smaller populations. If you can see, it's hard to see, but Ontario there actually has 4 elk reintroduced populations. So we've been doing this has been happening for the past 100 years, and some of these populations are doing really well and some are not so good. So basically my PhD was to look at, why are some populations reintroductions succeeding and why are some failing or not doing well. So one thing I found, one of many things when investigating, impacts to elk reintroductions, one thing that really caught my attention, something I was really interested in, was that elk were really getting hit by trains in that population just south of Sudbury and Burwash. This was documented over several years with the people who reintroduced elk, and it was really negatively impacting the population, one of the most important sources of mortality for this population. And as you can see here, unfortunately, 2 elk that had been hit by a train and subsequently died. So being a Western trained scientist, the first thing I did was started looking through the literature and seeing, what impacts do railways have on elk and other wildlife. And to my surprise, there was very few papers or research in general on the impacts of railways to wildlife. And this was really surprising to me because, spending some time out there, I had noticed a lot of animals using the railway. Here's a white-tailed deer that was actually approaching me. And I started wondering, like, how many species are using the rail? How many species are we seeing die on the railway? So I set up cameras along this railway section that bisected the elk range to try to get an idea of how many elk were using the railway, but to see what else was out there. And to my surprise, I found just about every medium to large mammal species that inhabits the area was using the railway, and not just once, but over and over and over, sort of a highway of linear corridor for movement. So here we have an elk, we have a red fox, a moose, 2 wolves, and a beautiful picture of a mom and 2 cubs. So of course I started sharing my work, sharing it with friends and colleagues through presentations. And some of my First Nation colleagues said, "Well, yeah, there's large mammals dying on the railway, but you should see how many turtles we're losing on the railway, our species at risk." And this really caught my attention because, first of all, every turtle species in Ontario is a species at risk. And this is not something that I had previously looked into as, having a focus on large mammal with my in academic, my academic focus being on large mammals. It was very, very interesting to me. So chatting specifically with community members from Magnetawan First Nation, Magnetawan First Nation was very interested in looking into this further. They have a great program for monitoring reptiles and amphibians, and this is something that was important to pursue. So, in partnership with Magnetawan First Nation, we engaged in Indigenous knowledge study where we started talking to community members and asking questions about railway impacts to wildlife. What species have you seen on railways using or dying? What impacts do railways have? And a lot of community members said things like this individual who said, when you go down the highway where the railway is, you see skeletons of animals, especially their heads, and they must have got hit by trains. So a lot of people having these observations and noticing a variety of species getting hit by trains. Jerry Smith from Magnetawan First Nation said, "We find a lot of turtles on the railway tracks. On hot days, those turtles step over the tracks. They don't even make it across the track sometimes because they start boiling right on the track there and they die within the track." So people observing that the turtles were getting stuck in between the ties and overheating, getting hit by trains, things like that. But a lot of people were noticing this, and actually 60% of the people that we talked to talked about turtles. So Shawanaga First Nation heard about this study and was interested in being part of it too, because this community, like Magnetawan, also has a railway directly bisecting their traditional territory. So we talked to community members from Shawanaga First Nation as well, and had a lot of the same observations and concerns. So not being a herpetologist or someone who studies reptiles and amphibians, I reached out to Dr. Jackie Litzkis, who's at Laurentian University in the Department of Biology, and we just and shared this information, and we decided to team up in partnership with Magnetawan First Nation and Shawanaga First Nation to further explore this. So we had a student go out and start doing railway surveys, and these railway surveys were basically directed by the Indigenous knowledge that was shared with us, in that, you know, this is what you should be looking for, this is when you should be looking, and this is where you should be looking. So this individual went out once a week documenting mortalities, and she did find, so this is both Magnetawan and Shawanaga First Nation, the different colored bars here. She did find some large mammal and small mammal and bird species deceased on the railway, but the most observations were herptofauna. So this is something like I never knew about, and not many people did. This is sort of new important information with regards to railway ecology, and again, very important because the turtle species here are species at risk. So making observations, it did appear that turtles were overheating on railways. Some were getting hit by trains. So the one here on the left is, these are both snapping turtles. The one on the left appears to be, you know, dried out, desiccated from the heat. The one on the right appears to have been hit by a train. Here's a painted turtle, and this one appears to have been stuck in this creosote, or this sort of turtle tar on the railway. And this is what community members were telling us about, that this sort of thing happens. They get stuck there, they overheat, and unfortunately they die. So these are things that Western science did not previously know about. And, you know, now that we know, we're learning more about this, bringing together Indigenous and Western knowledge to understand the impacts of railways to species in the region, we can start identifying, you know, where these hotspots are, areas where you're going to find more mortalities than other, and what's associated with those. So is it, you know, is it a whole bunch of areas where you have this turtle tar or creosote that's really important? And when we identify, you know, what factors are related, we can start thinking about mitigation strategies to help prevent these mortalities and work on conservation for these species. So master student Kyle Vincent is taking on this project now, and he did some more surveys last summer, and he's continuing on this work to try to help identify hotspots, working with Magnetawan and Shawanaga. So he's in the Department of Biology, co-supervised by myself and Dr. Jackie Litzkis. If you want to learn more, you can, I'm sure you'll find him around. So that's just one example of using a two-eyed seeing approach in ecological research, finding out things that, you know, was not previously documented by Western science. So it's really important that we start thinking about taking approaches in general. It's always important to take a two-eyed seeing approach, and to be inclusive and diverse in science, and to bring together ways of knowing, because you can better science in doing so. But especially now, species are disappearing at alarming rates. This is just a Greenpeace ad that I found online, but I think it really represents sort of what's happening today. You know, as humans, as our population increases, as our footprint increases, you know, animals like in this photo have nowhere to go, and we're seeing biodiversity collapses, and it's, you know, being suggested that we're entering the 6th mass extinction. We're in the Anthropocene, so, you know, climate change is wreaking havoc on the environment in general. So there's a lot of huge environmental crises and impacts today, and we need to come together to address these impacts. And of course, these impacts are not just happening to the environment and to the animals that live in the environment, but to the people who depend on the environment, which is all of us. We all depend on the earth for our survival. And especially for Indigenous people, many communities who still rely heavily on the land, you know, and way of life is interconnected to the environment. So not just for things like food security, but for well-being, for social relationships, for passing on traditions, for ceremony, for medicine, and so on. So one thing I'm learning through this work is that we really need to listen. We need to listen, especially well, to each other and to each other's different ways of knowing and seeing the world, but especially to the people who live on the land, who are the first people to see, you know, these environmental impacts. To Indigenous people who have, you know, intergenerational knowledge transfer and holistic insights to the world, and see, you know, these intricate interconnectivity of impacts, environmental impacts, and how, you know, how that impacts many different aspects of the environment. We need to listen to one another. Now, I did say that there are, you know, a lot of environmental issues and impacts and important things happening in the world today that we need to address, and we can better address those together. But thinking about with so many things happening, what are the priorities among First Nation communities? With Magnettawan and Shawanega First Nation, you know, those railway impacts, that was a priority to that community, one of many. But what are other research priorities, and how can we, you know, better come together to address these research priorities together in partnership? So another project that I'm working on, also with Magnettawan First Nation and others, is a project where we work to connect guardians in a changing world, or stewards, so environmental stewards, specifically in First Nation communities in the Anishinabek Nation. Again, because, you know, there are so many environmental issues, how can we bring each other together to discuss which of these issues are a big priority among communities? So this is a project in partnership with Magnettawan First Nation. I was part of Mount Allison University at the time, now with the University of Guelph. Dr. Deb McGregor, she's a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice at York University, and Adam Ford at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus. So we sort of came together to lead this project, which is actually part of a larger Canada-wide project. But I just wanted to share with you today the work that we're doing specifically with the Anishinabek Nation communities in the Great Lakes region. So basically what we did for this workshop is we invited community members from Anishinabek Nation communities in the Great Lakes region together to talk about environmental concerns. So what are your concerns? We invited a representative from each community's lands department, as well as an elder and youth, to try to help facilitate intergenerational knowledge transfer and get a wide range of perspectives. So in total, we had people representing 12 First Nation communities in the region, and about 37 individuals attend this workshop to discuss environmental issues. And because environmental issues can be, you know, this could be a huge discussion over a month. So based on what we knew were priority concerns in general, through talking to communities, through attending conferences and so on, we broke the workshop down into 2 days, with the first day focusing on climate change, and the second day focused on herbicide use in forestry. So two important issues to communities in the Anishinabek Nation. So for the sake of time, I will just talk to you today about the first day. So the day focused on climate change. So what we did here is we invited participants, and we broke up into smaller groups of sharing circles, where one facilitator would lead discussions and would try to determine what important research directions were and major concerns with respect to climate change. So we sort of had these three main questions with respect to climate change. So regarding climate change, what is your most important, what do you think the most important impact is to the environment, the most important impact to community and way of life, and the most important research direction to you or your community? So we asked these questions, and throughout the workshop, each facilitator paid attention to, you know, some of the things that were brought up most. And then we got together during one of the breaks, and we identified the top 5 areas of concern or things that were brought up collectively. So we wrote these on these large papers here you can see under each question. And then we asked all participants to take, so this is a dot voting method, so each individual would have 3 stickers, 1 for each question. And we asked individuals to go up and place a sticker on the area that what they thought was the most important for each research question, to kind of gauge, you know, what was the most important among everyone. So for the first question, what is your greatest climate change concern related to community and way of life? So people talked about understanding the land is becoming more difficult and unpredictable. So especially for people who rely on the land for, you know, for things like, you know, when the land says this is when I go fishing, or this is when I go harvest this medicine. So that's getting harder and harder with climate change. Decreased opportunities to harvest wildlife and medicines was something that was brought up. Climate change is affecting traditional and spiritual practices was the most important concern to people. So for an example is it's, you know, too dry to engage in controlled burns anymore because now it's becoming dangerous. There's limited capacity of communities to address climate change, and we need to identify where to allocate resources. Now, when asking people, so just going back to that question, so individuals shared a lot of different insights, and one person said, when I see species starting to disappear, I see my culture starting to disappear. And to me, that's like the worst thing that can happen. So impact to community and way of life, a lot of concern about, you know, the impacts to the environment impacting way of life because we're all interconnected. We are interconnected with the earth. So now with regards to the question, what is your greatest climate change concern to the environment? So people talked about animal and plant distributions changing, animal and plant life cycles changing, which seemed to be the most important concern, but water and life cycle, or water cycle and quality changing, biodiversity shifting, so populations declining, for example, and disease and parasites. One individual said the climate change impacts to those animals and environment will actually impact our community and way of life. So we really did find that participants had difficulty in distinguishing the impacts to the environment versus the impacts to community well-being because it is so intricately interwoven. And that's, you know, a really important insight. And I think that typically in the silos that we sort of build in research, you know, you have biology, you have social science, you have all these different sort of disciplines, but they need to be interconnected because yes, there are biophysical impacts of climate change to the environment, but those are interconnected with the impacts to people. So that's where, you know, we need to start having this interdisciplinary research or considerations in the work that we do, because that's just the way of the world. And so for the question, what is the most important climate change research direction? So this one more specifically focused on, you know, can we identify research directions that are important among communities so that maybe communities are interested in building partnerships, collaborations to address some of these research directions together. So water quality and quantity was identified, baseline animal and plant inventory and long-term monitoring. The thing that was most supported here was research and policies that include Indigenous and Western knowledge, but also risk assessments for communities and ecosystem approaches as opposed to species approaches. So again, you know, the interconnectedness of the environment is, you know, what happens to one species cascades into impacts to other species. So it's important to take a more holistic approach. So on the, so a lot of people talked about the need and interest in having research and policies that bring together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing. And individuals said things like traditional knowledge is scientific knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is equally as valuable as Western science. The value of Indigenous knowledge isn't taken seriously by Western ways of knowing. Western science, it can contribute, but it's not the be all end all. and science can complement our knowledge. So I'll talk more on that in a minute, but I just wanted to say that we wrapped up day one in a really great way. Important in the research that we do is, community engagement, youth involvement, learning opportunities, like what we were able to do at the end of this day here, where we had Scales Nature Park come in and bring in live reptiles. And everyone just had so much fun holding different snakes and turtles, and you could see there the youth kind of like in awe with a rattlesnake there. So it was a really, really fun event. And so we have two reports that have come from this event, which was actually held last November. One specifically on Anishinabek knowledge, concerns, and priorities related to climate change for the day one that I talked to you about. But then for day two, environmental and sociocultural impacts of glyphosate-based herbicide used in forestry, perspectives from Indigenous knowledge and Western science. So this report, taking a two-eyed seeing approach, bringing together concerns and knowledge from the people we had conversations with Western science to understand some research gaps with regards to herbicide use in forestry, which is a big concern because people are really concerned about the impacts to the environment as well as to way of life for that specifically. So Heather Patterson, who I co-supervised with Dr. Frank Mallory in the Department of Biology at Laurentian University, this is her master's project. And if you want to learn more about this, I'm sure you can find her as well. So the next steps of this work, because we want to build on this and the concerns that community members had. So one of the big priorities was, we want to be able to, we think that we want to be able to find ways to bring both Indigenous and Western knowledge, so two-eyed seeing, into research and policies. But the question that people had was, how do we do this? We want to do this, but how do we do this? So the priority research for that we're moving ahead with this project is just that: how to use two-eyed seeing in environmental monitoring and management. So there's Ella Bowles, who's a postdoc in my lab, is sort of leading this up. And she's going to use a two-eyed seeing approach to answer this question in looking through Western scientific literature and reports and finding out, what other researchers and communities have done that's been documented in the literature in terms of two-eyed seeing. And then we're also chatting with communities across Canada to get examples from them in different case studies. What have you done that's worked in your community, taking a two-eyed seeing approach? What hasn't worked? What could we do to do things better? So that's in progress right now, but also optimizing community-based environmental monitoring and prioritizing Indigenous knowledge systems and values. So a lot of communities are interested in developing monitoring tools that prioritizes Indigenous knowledge systems and values. Something that we need to think about a lot more, taking a two-eyed seeing approach in say wildlife monitoring, for example, but one that also ensures to prioritize Indigenous cultural values. So values like, involving youth and elders, and ensuring that you have opportunities for intergenerational knowledge transfer. So we're going to be chatting with people across the country about that as well, and working with specific communities on developing some tools for species specific or biodiversity in general. And continue contributing to facilitating connections and collaborations among communities. So we hope that we continue this workshop. COVID has really impeded in-person gatherings, as we all know, but now we're working on creative ways to connect everyone virtually, and so we're going to continue facilitating connections that way. So just to share a quote that was shared by one of the participants at the Connecting Guardians workshop, is that all of us, not just elders, not just you, everybody, we all need to be working together. So circling back to these major environmental impacts, and I think even if there weren't all these impacts, it's important to work together. We can do science better together. We can build great partnerships for co-monitoring, for co-management, for just joint decision making. By taking a two-eyed seeing approach, but also ensuring that we're doing it in a good way. So many of you might be aware that there has been a very poor history of engagement from researchers, from environmental consultants, from government, with Indigenous communities. And this is for many reasons, but for the most part, because research just hasn't been done in a good way. I was once talking to an elder and talking about getting an ecological project up and running. And we were talking a lot about the Western science side of things. And then I asked the elder, I said, well, do we want to, make sure that we take a two-eyed seeing approach and have Indigenous knowledge included in this? And that individual said, well, our community once worked with the provincial government. They came and they said they wanted to hear our Indigenous knowledge on a specific topic. And so our community shared our knowledge in the hopes that, we would help contribute to this environmental issue. But then he said, after the study, months went by, months and months, and he was just wondering, like, what happened to that study? Like, did the knowledge we share, was it helpful? Did something awesome happen? Like, are we contributing to change? And so he decided to reach out to that provincial government contact, and he said, what happened with that project? And that representative said, well, the knowledge that you shared it's in a report and it's just sitting on a shelf. And so he said, like, the knowledge we shared is collecting dust on a shelf. And, there has been that has been the general trend in the past where people come in, they try to take knowledge from community, which you can't do. You can't separate knowledge from community without giving back, without sharing results, without having meaningful relationships. So a very poor history, and that's something that, really needs to be considered by anyone who's thinking about engaging in research that takes a two-eyed seeing approach. So when I think about research that takes a two-eyed seeing approach, I like to think about a braid. And Robin Wall Kimmerer uses a braid as a metaphor in in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is an excellent book. And I like to think about, when we think about bringing together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing, one each strand, and braiding those strands together, if you let go of that braid with only two strands, it will just unravel. So making sure that you have that third strand, ensuring that you bring in research in a good way, that is how you make a strong braid, a strong relationship, and ensure success in research. So research in a good way, so important. And there's, of course, many different things that we can do to ensure we're engaging in research in a good way. This is a whole topic for discussion in its own. There are a lot of great books and Indigenous authors out there who talk about research in a good way. But things like ensuring that you're respectful, reciprocal, responsible in the work that you do, that work is co-led and not just coming to a community and saying, hey, you want to be part of my project, but leading and developing projects together, ensuring that there's opportunities for intergenerational knowledge transfer, elder and youth involvement, capacity building, reciprocity, so giving back to Indigenous communities, but also to the land. So lots of different things to consider, and anyone who's thinking about two-eyed seeing research, I'd strongly encourage you to definitely spend some time looking into this. So when thinking about frameworks for partnerships, I like to think of the two-row wampum, which is a 500-year-old treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. So basically here you see two purple rows. One represents a Haudenosaunee vessel, the other represents a Dutch vessel, and they're traveling along a river. And these three white lines representing the river also represent peace, equity, and empowerment. So each of these vessels is traveling along the river, not interfering into the affairs of the other, but being there to help one another for the greater good of the river, or in this case, we can think of the environment. So Jesse Wente, who's an Anishinaabe broadcaster, says that in thinking about inclusion and diversity, think of a forest. Is there one kind of tree? No. That tells us the natural way is diverse. So we can make science better by being inclusive and by being diverse, and ensuring that we're moving ahead in a good way. So with that, I'll say miigwech, and thank you to everyone for joining in and listening.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. Your presentations are always so visually beautiful because you get to spend lots of time in the outdoors. So that's always great to see. And you touched on so many amazing points that I'm very, very grateful that you were able to share with us today. Some of which about doing work in a good way, bring out concepts of Mino Bamadzoan, teachings around the braid, so important. And I think that those are great ways for Western scientists to get into these discussions and start learning more and growing from where they stand. One thing that I really enjoyed was your discussion on biodiversity. And I think sometimes we forget that culture and Indigenous knowledge is so directly related to that. So as colonization takes place and culture is removed from Indigenous people, regardless of it being, North America, South America, anywhere you look around the globe, we're losing knowledge of ecological biodiversity by rejecting Indigenous ways of living and learning and knowing. So I really appreciate that you're able to bring this back forward. And I am very hopeful when you talk because you work with so many great people who think the way you do in so many other ways. So I'm very grateful to hear from you today and love also that you included the wampum in your discussion. I think those are great tools. And we're just out of Treaty Recognition Week, so it's a great time to discuss wampums and everything like that. And I really loved your quote from Jesse Wente. The natural way is diverse. Absolutely. A healthy forest is very diverse. So we need to remember that in all perspectives and in Indigenous beliefs and understanding as well. So I'd like to pass it over to anyone from the audience that may have a question on any of the points that you discussed today. Personally, I had not really reflected on the impact of railways and the way that you discussed today. I mean, it makes perfect sense, but that's not something that I thought about on a daily basis. So thank you for that. Are there any questions or comments or related topics that we could discuss?
Hey, you guys, it's Charles. Can you hear me?
Hi, Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question, Jesse. It's about funding. Like, science doesn't happen without money. And the toughest type of work to get funded is ecosystem research because it's an enormous amount of work, it's enormously expensive, and it produces few papers. So, like you talked about the importance of doing whole system studies. How do we get around this problem?
Thanks, Charles. That's a great question. There can be a lot of funding difficulties, and I want to say that so going back to two-eyed seeing and how different ways of knowing can be complementary, Western science does take a reductionist approach for the most part. So sort of breaking things down into its smaller components so we can better understand little parts and then bringing it together later. And so we have, specialists like myself, like a wildlife ecologist or like a herpetologist. Although we do have community ecologists like yourself, Charles, but we often don't get the opportunity, well, at least as much as we should, to discuss how our work interconnects and to think more holistically. But that work is important. It's important to break things down and to have a better understanding of specific components. Indigenous knowledge systems, however, take a more holistic approach, understanding things as a whole and things as being more interconnected and not separate. So if trying to fund a study, for example, using a Western approach that looks largely and tries to consider interconnectivity, maybe it's difficult because it costs so much money to do that. But when you have people who have that understanding already through intergenerational knowledge and observations, to combine your work with people who are already specialists holistically can better help, fill those gaps and understand. So, that work still too comes with the need for funds, but maybe less so than having, Western science go out and trying to document everything on the land and collect data, because we already have individuals who have that data within them, right? So that's where I think building the partnerships can really help address that issue.
Thanks, Jesse. Oh, good luck at Guelph.
Thanks.
We have some students on the line, so I'd love to hear from some student perspective if we could. I was also interested about the elk reintroduction. So I think you've discussed lots of things in the past, but I don't recall that. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So that's been going on for about 100 years, the reintroduction.
Reintroductions in Eastern North America, yeah, for about a century, specifically in Ontario since between 1998 and 2001, we started reintroducing elk. So yeah, it's been happening for a while. Again, some populations are doing better than others, like any reintroduction. So just, it's important to try to figure out how to best optimize that, because it's expensive trying to reintroduce a species. So trying to figure out how to optimize that is important.
Do you think that there needs to be, or there is enough education with the general public about these kinds of discussions? Hunters, so people aren't expecting to see these populations or the species in certain areas. So how does that work on your?
I don't think there is enough education, but that is actually something that we've been discussing lately with people who were involved in bringing elk here, that we want to help further share that knowledge with people. I'll tell everybody who's listening in today that the elk population just south of Sudbury, if anybody's familiar with Burwash, it's at the Killarney turnoff there. You can go there from times like early morning to late evening, and you can see some really gorgeous animals coming out of the forest. They like the edge and they'll be in the field. So yeah.
Just to look at, right? That's why you want us to go take some pictures.
Yes, we definitely can't. We're not harvesting the elk because this population actually south of Sudbury is one of the ones that is doing very poorly. We are losing a lot of species, partly because of railway, maybe because of other reasons. But yeah, we're going to, I hope to start working again with elk to try to help mitigate some of those population decline. And just so I don't think I mentioned, but I was at Laurentian University and I moved out to New Brunswick for the last few years to work at Mount Allison University. So I just came back here. So back in Ontario.
I'm also wondering if you've seen anywhere in your travels these, you have bridges, animal bridges over highways and roads. Are there talks about doing this with railroads? Is it just out of the question because it's unpractical, or I don't think there's enough of these roadways, but you're seeing more and more of that. What's your opinion on these?
There's a wildlife overpass, so one of those bridges that goes over the highway just around the Killarney turnoff, and actually that was meant to in part help elk from getting hit by vehicles on the road as well as other species. Those are really, really expensive to build. And I think right now we don't know enough about the impacts of railways to wildlife to start thinking about building these structures. That could be a possibility in the future. But right now, since there's really not very much research at all, we need to learn a bit more to ensure that, if we're going to spend the money to do mitigation strategies like that, that they have to be, well informed.
I do have one question. Hello. Nice to meet you. So you've mentioned that you've involved Indigenous knowledge in quite a lot of projects for your students, I assume is what you were talking about. How do you involve either Indigenous partners or Indigenous knowledge when you've already started a master's? So I've heard a lot of projects that from the get-go are planning to involve either like Indigenous communities or Indigenous knowledge, and it's planned out really well. Do you have ways you can incorporate that when a master's is already underway?
Yeah, so I do get this question a lot. So people will ask, for example, how do I get Indigenous communities to be part of the work that I'm doing, just in general, for a master's or for any sort of work? And I think one of the best approaches is not to approach a community and say, hey, do you want to, be part of this work I'm doing, but hey, do you have research questions that I can help answer for you? There are a lot of concerns among communities, and some of them often that go unanswered because of capacity issues. And so a lot of times, you know, maybe communities would love to engage in work if it's helping address something that's important to that community. And maybe the work you're doing is something that would be that would help address an issue. And so, I mean, I relationship building is very important, and relationship building takes a lot of time, and often in our positions now, we don't have a whole lot of time available. I think everyone knows that we're always really busy, but more and more institutions and researchers are realizing that that has to be an important part of your work. If you want to work with communities, if you're thinking of doing work that takes a two-eyed seeing approach, you have to build in time for relationship building and ensuring that you're doing things in a meaningful way. I would suggest to anyone who's, you know, maybe doing a master's, that share your work at you know, conferences that are led by First Nations. There's a lot of conferences in the region, and you know, or even with a community in you know, if your work is in a community's traditional territory, you know, ask, hey, I'm doing this work, would you like to learn about it? And if there is interest from that community to work with you, then that's always something that you can discuss.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Yeah, great question. It goes back again to doing things in a good way and giving back. So yeah, same like that that individual had said about, you know, reports collecting dust on a shelf somewhere. So this, you know, all this Indigenous knowledge benefits science a great deal. So how are we going to use it in an appropriate way and put it into practice, right? So important. Any other questions or comments regarding any of these things? If not, I'm going to keep asking questions because I have a million.
Yeah, actually, hi, thank you so much for your presentation. As you know, publications are really important for Western scientific careers. A lot of employers will look at your number and quality of publications when they're hoping to hire you. Do you have any tips or recommendations for including traditional knowledge, how to properly source, cite traditional knowledge, and how to include indigenous knowledge in sort of Western academic setting, because that's something I'm not really familiar with.
Thanks, Heather. That is such a really good question. So thank you for that question. And I will, so yes, I'm very familiar with you know, how science works, and that publications are really important. I personally wish they weren't as important as we've placed the value, but it is important to get your results out, I feel. And there's different ways that you can get your results out, and it very, very important, because that's the point of the work, right, is to share the results and make change. More and more, I'm hearing that institutions are starting to consider, you know, community engaged scholarships and things like reports, as opposed to just scientific publications. So you want to reach as many people as you can, of course, to share your important work. But things like reports for communities are important too. So, and then thinking about how to represent Indigenous knowledge in scientific papers or reports or anything, that's an important question regarding ensuring that you're doing research in a good way. The one thing I forgot to mention, and again, I said that conversation is just so big to ensure that you're doing research in a good way, but ensuring that you're being ethical and that you're following the OCAP principles, so ownership, control, access, and possession. And so a lot of all the times, whenever you engage in research through an academic setting that involves human participants, so asking people to share knowledge, you have to ensure that you have ethics approval. And you have to have, you know, people very aware of the research that they're engaging in and what those results will be used for. So that's an important step. And when you ensure that you have that, an approach that other researchers and myself take is you can then use the information that was shared with you. Often you're recording using audio recorders or something like that. You can reflect quotes like I did in my presentation on what people have shared with you. And you can, you know, come up with general trends. Like I said, 60% of people were concerned about or saw that turtles were dying on the railway. The other thing you can do is invite collaborators to co-author papers with you. You know, you won't need ethics for that because the individuals actually an author. So being part of writing that together to share insights and knowledge that way. So there are a lot of different ways to do this, and you're right. These ways are hard to find in the literature now. They're there, but they're hard to find because you know, in the recent past, science wasn't so inclusive. But things are changing, and they're changing rapidly, and people are interested in reconciling ways of knowing in science. So we're going to start seeing more and more of these different examples in the scientific literature of how different knowledge systems are brought together. And it's going to be different than you're familiar with, but that's okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hadn't occurred to try to include co-authors specifically from the community. I am, of course, I'm just a master's student. So the authorship thing is very new to me. Thank you for your very considerate answer.
Can I just add to that? I'm curious if you've included the braiding aspect in your methodology or in your theory, because you talk about it. So is it actually part of your framing and your research?
Well, it's part of what guides the work that happens in my lab. So so all the work, everything that we do, we ensure that we are doing research in a good way. So that's a big part of the training that happens in my lab, is discussions on how to ensure that we're doing work in a good way, and learning, always learning. There's, you know, lots of really incredible scholars to learn from and learn more about every day. So yeah, definitely infused in the work that we do.
Thank you. David?
Hi, Jessie. Thanks. And good to see you again. I was going to follow up on what Heather mentioned about how to involve more. And I think, I guess part of it is a question, part of it is a comment of what I've seen at Laurentian moving on, especially with the introductions of the Masters of Indigenous Research, is bringing colleagues from Indigenous background early on in the research. And I think bringing them as your committee member, for instance, on a master's or a PhD, really make sure you're going in the right direction, because so often in the past, from what I've learned, I'm not from Canada, but from what I've seen, it's the Western science or the Western researchers always come sort of at the end. They go and collect the data, they do what they think is the right thing for science, and then they might or might not return to the First Nation community and say, oh, this is what we found, and just take it, as opposed to bringing those members and their traditional knowledge as the onset of the design of the project. And I think that's what Jessie has done a lot. And not only does it make her research successful, but I think it makes her research more impactful for both sides of the coin, the traditional and the more Western-oriented research, is to bring elders or community members, or I've worked with Jerry, that was mentioned earlier in the talk, as at the early days of the Highway 69 project that we led, and really that connections we had, that discussions we had, were very useful in designing the type of research and how we were gonna try to get at those questions we were looking for in a meaningful way with their input. So I guess my question on that is, how do you feel, Jessie, that elders and other members of communities are welcoming the research scientists, the Western scientists, to invite them on those type of conversation and be part of a committee for students or something else? Or do you think there's still a lot of reluctance to be part of this, that they are sort of giving up on their traditions and giving up on their fight or their cause if they join a student committee or a Western type research paper?
Yeah, that's a good question, David. So first of all, yeah, I completely agree that projects should be co-developed, co-led, throughout the whole process, working together on it through entirety. Your comments on committee is a good comment. So the approach, I think that would be great if universities, and if Laurentian is considering that, that's awesome to have.
It's already in place. There's no barrier. I know for a lot of the committee members, usually the Faculty of Grad Studies looks at CVs, which is not something relevant for a member of the First Nations. I mean, they have a CV, but it's not a research type CV. But we broke that years ago now. And when I was there, I could say to people, like, if you want someone that brings traditional knowledge, it's meaningful for your project, there's no question I would not approve it. So that's been in place in several. It's very centered around the Masters of Indigenous Research, but I wish more and more biology projects, sociology projects would ask and would make sort of, would tap on those resources that we tend to forget.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And actually, I am co-supervising 2 students at Laurentian, and I didn't know that that was an approach. And I am from another university, so I'm not familiar with what's happening within the university. But it would be great to share that more widely. I don't know if maybe people just aren't aware, but that's so awesome. Like the approach that I've taken so far is, so for example, with one student's project, we have, her formal committee, but then we also have a committee of community members that we basically have 2 meetings all the time, like one to get the community perspective and one the more academic perspective. But if you could bring that together in academically, that is awesome. And I'm so excited to hear that. In terms of your question on reluctance of communities to work with researchers, yeah, I still think there's a lot of that. And I guess it depends on the community as well. Like there's different experiences with different communities, but I do still feel a lot of reluctance, and for good reason. So as we know, there was a very poor history, and still today, I'm sure that there are people like not engaging in a good way. So there's reluctance to, like, when you break trust, it takes a long time to rebuild, right? So I'm sure it is going to take a long time to rebuild with some communities, and that's something that we need to be ready to invest our time into, because it's worth it. It's worth it when the outcomes are so incredible for the earth and for each other. Thanks, David.
I think
Hi.
Go ahead, Dr. Beckett.
Okay, well, hi Jesse, thanks very much. That was an excellent presentation. I learned a lot, which is great. I'd also, are you in contact on a regular basis with Dave Pearson and the kind of stuff he's doing? You share experiences?
Yeah, I have been in contact with him. We have discussed too, because we've been doing a little bit of similar work with the climate change aspect. So we've been chatting. He's doing some really awesome work as well.
Right. And just for David, I didn't even know there was a policy, but I'm actually on 2 committees, MSc committees, which I serve. There is an Indigenous representative as part of that committee. I just do it, so never mind.
And you have no reason not to do so. Good job, Peter.
It's great to hear that you just go ahead and do it. I think that it's important to have strategically placed faculty using their privilege for things like this. Is really excellent to hear. Did you have a question?
No, it's me.
So last call for questions from everyone. If there's nothing else, I just again want to thank Dr. Jesse Popp for sharing with us. Every time we hear from you, there's so much knowledge that comes out of it, and I know I'm not the only person that has light bulbs going off, and I want to go research and educate myself on different topics. So I hope that everyone has a full heart, full brain from this conversation today, and that we're able to move change at Laurentian and in whichever area you're working in, research, academic, on-campus practices. Again, I'd like to thank you for your time and efforts, and thank you to all the participants for joining today. And this will be aired or released on Tuesday as part of our Indigenous Education Week lineup. So don't forget to check out our schedule. There's lots of great discussions going on. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for having me. I just wanted to mention quickly, because I know there's a lot of biology folk there. I was invited to give a seminar next week as well in the biology department. There's going to be a bit of overlap in the presentation there. So don't feel like you need to attend both. But I want to say thank you to Laurentian in general for inviting me and for inviting me twice. It's going to be great to share my work and hear from you. And always happy to be part of these discussions.
Well, we just love to hear from you, obviously, from all the different departments. So great to hear. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.